Hello, friends of Slator Pod, and hello, Esther.
Hi, Florian. Hi, everyone.
Hi there. Great packed agenda today. I managed to quiet down the builders again. I know you all want to know about this.
Good.
No, I mean, as I said, there's construction going on. I had to run up again and tell these people to be quiet for just 30 minutes. And they're kind enough to do it. So, quick announcement first. We'll start off with our new online conference called SlatorCon Remote. Then we're going to talk about Netflix and machine translation. We're going to look into some of the local, hyper-local markets, RSI via Zoom, which we talked about maybe 2 episodes ago, and got some very interesting listener feedback on that. And then we're going to talk about France and how they protect the realm of their language.
You're going to teach me some new words, I think, for this, some French vocab, right?
So, I'm not going to teach anybody any French. I speak Français fédéral, like all of the Swiss do, which is a terrible version of French. It's not my forte. So, all right, let's kick off with a super exciting announcement. So we're going to do SlatorCon Remote, and I'm so sorry to say it's not going to be free. It's going to cost... Oh, no. We ran the numbers, and I think free doesn't make a lot of sense.
Free doesn't make a lot of money.
Well, yeah, I mean, actually, once you scale a conference like that up to like 500-600, which we need to potentially plan for, you're actually going to pay a little bit of money for the tool, right?
Yeah.
So we're gonna, it's gonna be, well, but it's still super affordable. It's $25. And we haven't even really announced it or promoted it yet, but we already get a fair amount of registrations, so it's super encouraging. Great agenda, very kind of standard SlatorCon agenda, super across all of the elements of all of the areas of the language industry. So go check it out. It's still a little bit of work in progress in terms of the agenda, but we're going to get this lineup up there in the next 2 weeks, definitely. So really looking forward to it. And also got a first sponsor, EasyLing. So thanks to EasyLing for helping us with this. Now, also another housekeeping announcement. We try to do something new, and we spoke about it before the podcast, Esther. We think it might be interesting for listeners to send us their recorded questions or input or suggestions for things to discuss.
Yeah.
And I got this idea from Pivot, which is one of the most popular podcasts with Kara Swisher and Scott Galloway, and they're also getting listeners to send them their audio questions. So don't send emails with written questions. You're going to have to record it. So let's see if this.
What about video? Will we accept video submissions?
Sure, if video has an audio track, then yeah. So let's see. Any input, any question you want us to discuss on the podcast? Any suggestions as to what to discuss? It doesn't necessarily have to be a question, of course. Then we're happy to answer and discuss it. So first, Esther, we picked up on another one of those research papers, but this time not from Google, Amazon, or the usual empty suspect, but from our friend Netflix. So what was this about? It was quite interesting.
Right. Yeah, it was interesting, actually. And I think for maybe for a different reason than I was expecting when I sort of read the title or whatever. But so Netflix has published a paper called Simplify Then Translate, Automatic Pre-Processing for Black Box Translation. So this is actually bringing together machine translation, as we would expect, but also sentence simplification, which is another discipline, a separate discipline of natural language processing. It's not something that I personally have seen a whole lot of in machine translation research recently, but actually Netflix had quite an interesting take on it. So sentence simplification is nothing new in and of itself, and the idea really is that source sentences that are simpler source sentences, there we go, are easier to translate than ones which are more complex, and having a simpler source leads to more fluent translations. So it's also well established, Netflix says, that translated content itself is fundamentally simpler than the original source content. when you translate, it tends to be slightly more simple, I guess, generally speaking. So Netflix actually took that a step further and said that logically, therefore, content that has been back translated, so into the original source, in this case English, is also simpler than the very original source. So this is kind of really what their test and what their experiment relied on. It was on the idea of back translating a lot of content that they'd previously translated into French, Italian, German and English, using the back translation into English to actually build a model to simplify future source content. And so the ultimate goal then is, they specifically mentioned targeting low resource languages to try and sort of improve the quality of machine translation for low resource languages, but its application is not necessarily limited to low resource languages.
So it's quite... I'm not sure if convoluted is the right way, but it's like it's combining it's combining this one discipline of NLP with machine translation. Then it's only for the low resource languages, and it assumes things like the translation's kind of per definition going to be somewhat simpler than the original. And then there was an interesting point that somebody made on LinkedIn when we posted it, by saying, like, once you actually simplify the source and translate it, aren't you going to make it less culturally rich, right? Because let's assume this isn't even for MT, but like for maybe preparing the source for a human translation and trying to make this faster, more efficient, automated, whatever. I mean, some of these expressions in the source are, they're beautiful, they're rich in like meaning, and then if you try to make it super simple, then you translate it super simple, obviously it's not going to come across very naturally.
You're gonna lose a lot, I would say, in the final output, because you can't insert that idiom or that kind of cultural expression back into the translation when it doesn't actually exist in the source in the first place. That's right. So I think there is something that will be lost in translation. Or in simplification, we should say, because actually it's a simplification step that removes that layer of interest and richness, I suppose.
So, I mean, taking a step away from this particular paper, it's just interesting that we're seeing Netflix generally going on these pre-publication servers and publishing machine translation research, right? I mean, they haven't been one of the more... they haven't been publishing a lot, or that they weren't among those that published a lot, as opposed to like Google publishing something all the time. Now Apple, we're seeing more Apple, we're seeing Amazon, and now you got Netflix also going out. So, for what it's worth, I think it's an interesting development. I write in today's newsletter, I don't think this is like an immediate threat or anything for these media localizers, but you still want to understand what they're pushing out there and the research directions they're looking at, and are willing to disclose publicly in those research papers, right? There's probably a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes we don't know. I mean, the people that wrote this paper are, they've been with Netflix for a long time, some of them, right? 4 or 5 years, and they've been in machine learning, and their LinkedIn profiles say they're working on machine translation. So this is nothing new, but now they're going out and publishing it. All right, back to the the world of language industry without machine learning teams of Netflix, so to speak. So we published a wrapper article, a short primer this week around 9 specific translation markets that we feel are fairly local. So let me briefly explain. There's certain parts in this business, certain accounts that you can do very much globally, right? It doesn't really matter where you're based as a company. These big enterprise accounts, the deals are made at some central location, and then you do a follow the sun account management. You run these deals globally, and it doesn't really matter where you're based as a company. As long as you have access to the decision makers, you're in competition to win some of these accounts. But then there is also a very strong, a lot of the language industry operates also on hyper kind of local markets where you need to have people on site, you need to have salespeople to uncover this, you need to manage those local relationships, and then some of the actual work is very local as well. There's certain translation markets that don't exist in other countries. I think one of the most case in point examples here would be IPO prospectuses in Hong Kong, and that's also something I'm very familiar with because it was one of my biggest client segments when I worked in Hong Kong for an LSP. So Hong Kong, I mean, just set aside the current troubles that Hong Kong is in, but it's a very active market for public listings. They have like 2,500 companies listed there. There's a bilingual requirement. You publish it in English and traditional Chinese. So these listing prospectuses are, hundreds and hundreds of pages, and there's a very complicated process to draft them, along with the lawyers, the bankers, etc., and the translators. It's a very kind of integrated approach, and so this is something that this type of market is something that you can't service from outside of Hong Kong. You have to be in Hong Kong. You have to even have some of the translators, the core ones need to be in Hong Kong, and definitely account management and all of that needs to be based locally, right? So that was just one examples of for a market in translation localization where you kind of have to be on site to actually get the business, win the business, understand the business. And then we looked at some others that also have a local component. So maybe you're going to talk a bit about that now?
Yeah, I can pick up a couple of examples as well. I mean, just to continue, I suppose, that theme of the on-site nature, the services that have been sort of traditionally delivered on site. So if you think about, for example, dubbing, or you think about interpreting, where it's actually a physical presence required, those markets still to a large extent are pretty hyper-local, even if there are some remote aspects coming into that sort of rapidly with technology. So one example that we came up with really was the immigration interpreting in the Nordics. So it's a huge market, it's corporatized, but it is pretty impenetrable really for suppliers who aren't actually already established in the market and who aren't already local to the countries. And there's a few reasons why that is, really. I mean, firstly, if you think about the market in Europe or EU for translation procurement or interpreting procurement specifically, the EU tender process is super bureaucratic. So you have these lengthy tender responses. There's a whole bunch of requirements that, might span hundreds of pages. So actually, it's very bureaucratic. It's very time consuming, and you need to actually understand as a first step even how to do the tender, let alone deliver the actual service. And then also coupled with that, you have a lot of fragmentation as well of the demand. So a lot of these contracts are actually awarded on a local basis. So by sort of local authorities. And it's not like, for example, maybe in a different setting where you would go all in with one big tender and you would emerge from it and win a contract that's worth sort of 50 million euros or 20 million euros. Actually, it's dozens and dozens of very smaller ones. So the cost of doing business there is also quite high and quite sort of specific. So that I think would be a pretty good example of how on-site and local some of these actually sort of corporatized markets can be.
Yeah, we also had another one with TechDoc in southern Germany or maybe even eastern Switzerland, where all these what they call like hidden champions, these engineering firms that are exporting worldwide. You're not going to crack that market with an office in Chicago, right? And some remote like client management. I mean, you need to be on site. You need to understand that space. You need to be able to talk to the client. And even though those may be very large deals, I mean, even if you're a very global LSP, you still need a presence on site, people who speak the language, etc. We also mentioned another one, like general kind of tech localization. Obviously centered around Silicon Valley, but there's a fair amount of other big tech clients out there where you need to be extremely techy. It's you need to be on site, yes, to understand that, but you also need to bring a lot of tech expertise and understand these clients, and that's something that I doubt you can deliver even remotely. Despite you would assume that tech it lends itself a bit more to that particular vertical. Now, that said, this is also one of the key problems challenges when people are making assumptions in their pitches about, hey, I'm looking for funding, I'm going to quote unquote disrupt the $30 billion localization market. Well, no, you're not, because out of those 30 billion, you're not going to be able to capture 90%. Like, it's just, how are you going to do that? How are you going to deliver IPO prospectuses to a company in Hong Kong, do web localization to a startup in the Silicon Valley, and at the same time, do public sector interpreting in Finland,
Norway or something. Yeah,
Norway.
Yeah.
I think the first two you might be able to do. Probably TransPerfect or Lionbridge manages to do both, but but then doing the public sector interpreting in Norway, that's going to be a stretch, right?
Yeah, but you can't. You also can't come in and do that from nowhere. As a if
right.
you're using the analogy or the idea of funding, you can't come in and do all of those markets from nothing.
Exactly. So when they throw out these big figures, it's hard. Like it's not really, those are not real. The market as such is that big, but it's not one unified market that you're going to be able to disrupt, right?
Right.
That said, few people are trying to get funding right now to disrupt anything, I guess, at the moment. So let's move on to a company that, in fact, well, I'm not sure if they've disrupted, but they certainly got a nice COVID boost there, and that's Zoom. So we spoke about Zoom and wondered whether there's an interpreting function, and we got some listener email that indeed there is.
That's right. Yeah, bit of an email exchange with the conference interpreter this week, who said that she's been doing interpretations on Zoom for more than a year. So apparently this has existed for some while, even though we weren't aware. Yeah, and it seems to be super simple from what she said. The feedback was that it's extremely user-friendly from the interpreter's perspective, and all you need to do really is click on like an invite link and select your language pair and then go. And generally speaking, her feedback was really positive, and said that really all they need to do, Zoom, is to tweak a couple of things and it should be a really solid interpreting option. So that's pretty high praise, I suppose, for somebody who's been actively using it. And yeah, I mean, I like it because it's sort of, well, from my perspective, it's kind of crept up on me. Certainly, I didn't really realize this was a thing. But I suppose more widely, it actually kind of presents a possible alternative to some of the sort of interpreting platforms that are being developed and sort of trying to capture market share also within this space.
Yeah. Again, if any listener has additional information about how these tools stack up against Zoom, I mean, I'm sure Zoom is kind of more the standard, non-custom, not anticipating all the devil in the detail problem that a lot of the other RSI providers have anticipated and have implemented. But it's certainly, I mean, Zoom is the what was it, 1,000 pound gorilla or something in the room. So if they decide to really tweak the interpreting function and make it even more user friendly, then that's certainly a challenge for some of the standalone providers. As far as I can see, I mean, having not really looked into this in great detail, these RSI providers, of course, as we spoke in the past, are benefiting from this whole remote push, while the in-person conferencing is all canceled and they're losing business there. There's certainly a huge boost in interest on how to go remote. So so in the long term, it's a net positive for them. So yeah, thanks for pointing this out, and we'll again encourage listeners to get in touch if they want us to talk about something or have information about something that we wondered about in the podcast. So then another quick story we ran today, it's not one of the business stories, it's more around language, which I found very interesting, that the French government, or I guess we can say the French government, in the Journal Officiel, they announced 18 terms that apparently need translation, in trying to avoid all those anglicisms from polluting the French language. So among them would be podcast. And they suggest that audio à la demande should be podcast, and other things like. I think you should read them.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't have the list.
Okay, like auto-tune.
You do it, and then I'll do it.
Auto-tune, clickbait, deep fake, spoiler, and then there's some random things in there, like social media manager.
Oh yeah, so that's like a job title then.
Yeah, job title, sensitivity reader, fashion tech. I mean, I get like those are a little random. I get why they would maybe want to have a French equivalent for fake news or clickbait or podcast, which are like words that are used very often, but like, I don't know, social media manager, really? Is that the job title? You need a local version? What about the 7,000 other English job titles?
Des réseaux sociaux. Yeah, okay, I've got it here now.
What is it? Social media manager?
Well, there's one which is social media manager. Oh wait, I've just lost it. Responsable des réseaux sociaux. Responsible for social networks. And then you've got, well, some of them are super random, like showrunner for a TV series. So, I mean, in English, well, I just call that a runner. But they've got directeur, directrice.
That's just...
Which seems strange, but okay. Yeah.
And then like time-lapse filming.
Time-lapse filming. Ooh. Hyper-accéléré.
Yeah, okay. That's the thing on the iPhone. I think guess, that's right?
Yeah, but I mean,
the time lapse.
An adjective. Is that adjective? You'd have to say like a photography hyper-accéléré. I don't know. Yeah. Haven't seen these used in context. Do you know the one thing that this made me think of is like when I was living in France and Luxembourg, or just learning French generally as an English speaker, you're kind of hyper aware of some of these things. So you actually go out of your way to use the French version, because we've been taught in school, they don't like the Anglicisms, use the French version. And then actually, sort of when you get to being in the culture, I mean, a lot of these things, and certainly in a business context where I was working, it was just so many sort of English words, like English dropping, basically.
Yeah.
I mean, words just dropped into the sentence or kind of slightly Frenchified, I suppose. So,
and is there a difference?
I don't know how.
Sorry, is there a difference between, Luxembourg and France? Like, no.
Well, I suppose culturally, yes, definitely. Yeah. I mean, Luxembourg is a business centre, lots of expats, lots of English speakers generally, like as a second language as well as a first language.
Yeah, I mean, it's similar here versus Germany, here being Switzerland versus Germany. Switzerland has like 4 national languages, and Germany is very, German speaking, and Germany tends to translate / localize more English terms. Sometimes when I go to Germany, I'm like, oh, okay, that's actually a beautiful German word for the thing we in Switzerland use an English word for, right? And case in point was really that the Corona crisis now, where they had the Swiss government, for example, had daily press conferences, in French, Italian, German. It's really interesting. Like they're switching back and forth. Like journalist asks question in French, then federal council response in German, and it was just like one big language melting pot. But the point being, everybody used the English term social distancing and contact tracing. Like there was no attempt made to translate those 2 words, right? And now social distancing and contact tracing are now standard terms being used in Switzerland. And especially for social distancing, I mean, there would be a beautiful German equivalent, and social, and contact tracing, I guess, as well. I'm sure you can do a nice German compound for that.
No doubt.
I don't know why we're so easily being pushed around by English, but that's
I don't know. I don't think it's sort of the English again imposing, English words. Let's put it that way.
No, of course not. No, but the French are having none of it, and they're making sure that they're giving the appropriate recommendations. I mean, Académie Française was founded in the 17th century, so there's a pretty long history of doing this kind of work. And that was a time when French was. Can I just tell you my
favorite one? My favorite word that I've seen on the list is divulgacher, which is spoiler, because it's like it's a combination of to divulge and to spoil and to like ruin. So it's like.
But I'm sure in this context, spoiler is probably just like spoiler alert, spoiler.
Yeah. Right?
Yeah,
like on a TV. Program or something, but it's like, oh, you're giving something away and and therefore you're ruining it. So
that's it. Yeah. We're not gonna spoil. No, we don't have any spoilers.
For what?
I don't know. For nothing. So, all right. Well, again, reminder, SlaterCon Remote, July 9th, 25 US dollars only. So you get to experience the, remote SlaterCon experience for a fraction of a ticket. That said, though, I am kind of becoming a little more confident that in-person events will restart maybe towards the end of the year in more globally. I mean, yeah, we didn't do our Corona update, so here they open up to 300 people events now in Switzerland in a week from now. Schools are back fully normal in a week, so it's really they're even thinking about like soccer games and like bigger things now. So yeah,
in front of audiences as well. The football games, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, not packed stadiums, maybe like some spacing out things, but yeah, I mean, things are looking to come back very gradually. But in the meantime, and possibly beyond, we're going to do SlaterCon Remote, and I really look forward to having a lot of people in that, and also getting some audience input. So that's it for today. Tune in next week again. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Bye-bye.